Before we dive into today's topic, welcome back to Plain. Explain the place where complex ideas are unraveled with calm clarity and curiosity. Every week, we take concepts that often feel distant or intimidating, and we bring them down to earth. Today's idea is one of the most influential numbers in the modern world. It shapes policy guides, global decisions, and influences how we judge a country's success. But beneath the surface, it hides some surprising blind spots. So let's take a quiet moment, slow down the noise, and look at what GDP really tells us and what it doesn't. If you've ever watched the news, you've probably heard a politician proudly say something like, "Our GDP is growing faster than ever." But have you ever stopped to wonder? What does that actually mean? Can a country really be getting richer, while most people feel like they're falling behind? And why do some nations with high GDP still feel surprisingly unhappy? Today we're going to unpack one of the most famous numbers in the world, a number that shapes elections, influences global power, and decides how successful we think a nation is. GDP, Gross Domestic Product. 3 words that look intimidating at first, but hide a simple yet surprisingly flawed idea. And once you understand what GDP truly measures and what it completely ignores, you'll start seeing economic news in a very different way. Let's begin with a simple thought experiment. Imagine you buy a brand new smartphone. Congratulations, the economy just grew. But if you grow your own vegetables at home or fix something yourself instead of hiring someone, the economy didn't grow at all. Strange, isn't it? It already hints at something important. GDP only counts certain types of value, while ignoring others that might matter even more. So let's take this step by step. First, what is GDP really? At its core, GDP is just the total value of everything a country produces in a year. Everything we buy, everything businesses make everything. The government spends everything we export minus what we import. Economists summarize it in a formula, but you don't need the formula. You just need the intuition. Think of GDP like tracking how much money flows through a giant national checkout counter. Every coffee you buy, every movie ticket, every haircut, every car built, every office built, every hospital funded. It all passes through that counter. And at the end of the year, GDP simply adds up the total cost of that activity. In a way, GDP answers one big question: how busy is the economy? But here's where things get interesting. Being busy doesn't always mean being better off. And that's the key to understanding both the power and the limits of GDP. Now let's look at what GDP is actually good at measuring. First, GDP captures economic activity. When GDP rises, factories are producing more, businesses are hiring more, and consumers are spending more. It's like checking the pulse of the economy. A strong, steady pulse usually means things are going well. Second, GDP helps us compare countries. If country A has a bigger GDP than country B, then yes, country A does produce more economic output. Though that doesn't necessarily mean the people there live better, but we'll get to that later. Third, GDP helps governments and central banks make decisions. If GDP is slowing down, policymakers might cut interest rates, adjust taxes, or increase spending to prevent a recession. So GDP is not useless. It's actually a very powerful tool, as long as you remember that it's only measuring one dimension of a very complex world. And that brings us to the more interesting part, what GDP completely misses. And trust me, this list is longer than most people expect. Let's start with the most obvious omission. GDP does not measure happiness. A country could double its GDP, but if people are overworked, stressed, lonely, or anxious, that economic growth doesn't show up in the statistics. GDP doesn't care whether families have time to be together. It doesn't care whether people feel fulfilled or burned out. It only counts spending, not well-being. Second, GDP ignores income distribution. If the richest 10% of people earn all the new wealth, GDP still goes up, even though the majority of the population sees no improvement in their lives. Think about that. GDP could rise sharply, yet most people could feel poorer, and GDP would not blink. Third, GDP ignores unpaid work. If you cook dinner for your family, it doesn't count. If you take care of your children or your elderly parents, it doesn't count. If you volunteer, help your neighbors, or fix something yourself, GDP doesn't care. Some of the most essential work in society caring, nurturing, supporting is economically invisible. Fourth, GDP ignores the environment. Cut down a forest and sell the wood. GDP goes up. Pollute a river and spend billions cleaning it. GDP goes up again. GDP counts the cost of fixing problems, but not the cost of creating them. It's a number that loves economic activity, whether that activity is good or bad. Fifth, GDP ignores long-term sustainability. If a country boosts GDP by using up its resources faster than nature can replace them, GDP says, "Great job." But the future might say, "What were you thinking?" Short-term activity doesn't always mean long-term prosperity. Sixth, GDP struggles with quality. If a new phone costs the same as last year, but is dramatically better, GDP treats both as identical. If healthcare becomes more expensive without necessarily becoming better, GDP goes up anyway. And this leads to one of the strangest paradoxes in economics. Sometimes the economy can look strong on paper, while people's actual lives are not improving at all. Let me give you a few examples that reveal the weirdness of GDP. Traffic jams increase GDP. Car accidents increase GDP. Natural disasters increase GDP. More pollution can increase GDP. Rising medical bills can increase GDP. In all of these cases, the economy looks like it's growing, but that growth often comes from problems, not progress. It's like measuring how healthy someone is by counting how much medicine they buy. More medicine doesn't always mean more health. Now, with all these flaws, you might wonder, why do we still use GDP? The answer is because it's simple, consistent, and easy to compare across countries. GDP might be imperfect, but it's better than having no measure at all. And to be fair, economists have created better indicators that complement GDP. One of these is GDP per capita GDP, divided by the number of people. It gives a slightly clearer picture of how much output each person could theoretically benefit from. Still imperfect, but better. Another measure is the Human Development Index, or HDI. It includes life expectancy, education, and income. Not just money, but quality of life. Some countries even track happiness directly. Bhutan famously measures gross national happiness, which looks at emotional well-being, cultural preservation, and the health of the environment. There are also indexes that track environmental sustainability, inequality, and social stability. The point is, GDP is not the whole picture. It's just the easiest part to measure. So what should we take away from all of this? GDP is useful, but incomplete. It tells us how fast money is moving, but not where it's going or who benefits from it. It tells us how busy the economy is, not how healthy, fair, or joyful society is. It's a snapshot of activity, not a portrait of well-being. Relying on GDP alone to judge a nation is like looking at a black and white photograph of a colorful world. It shows shape and structure, but not meaning, not nuance, not the richer truth underneath. Maybe a better question for the future is not simply, how much did the economy grow? But instead, are people living better lives? Is progress sustainable? Are we building a society that works for everyone? GDP will always have a place in those conversations, but it should never be the only voice in the room. If GDP doesn't measure happiness, if it doesn't measure fairness, if it doesn't measure sustainability, then perhaps the real question isn't, how do we grow the economy, but what are we growing it for? Because in the end, an economy is supposed to serve people, not the other way around. Thanks for spending your time with Plain Explain, where we explore the hidden logic behind the world around us. If this video helped you see GDP in a new light, consider joining us again for the next explanation. Because the more we understand, the better decisions we can make as individuals and as a society. Feel free to leave a comment about what concept you'd like to see explored next. And until then, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and remember, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that grows is progress. See you in the next one.